One of the key texts of post-war urban design is Oscar Newman's defensible space, Crime Prevention Through Urban Design, published in 1972. Newman's book built on the earlier work of C. Ray Jeffrey called Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. And together they set off an industry geared to uncovering the way that criminal activity could be offset by good design. A well-established aspect of that process is Secured by Design, a police and Home Office strategy to encourage architects, planners and clients to take seriously the need to discourage or prevent criminal activity. The Secured by Design strategy has recently been given a broader remit than just architecture, but this programme will explore urban design specifically. Here to discuss these issues raised are Gary Fisher, who's Senior Development Officer with the Association of Chief Police Officers, Secured by Design, and Alistair Donald, a researcher at the Martin Centre for Architectural and Urban Studies in Cambridge. Welcome to you both. Thanks for coming in. Can I just start with you, Gary? Just before we go into detail, can you just explain what Secured by Design is, the intent behind it?
Certainly. Secured by Design is a police initiative where the police service can get involved with designers and planners to help reduce crime through good design.
And the scheme began, I mean, I remember back in the 80s, maybe I'm wrong, but did it start in the 80s? How did it develop from there?
It did, yes. It started in the late 80s. In 1989, it started as a result of some research that was done in the southeast region of the UK. And they found that there was a huge rise in house burglary. When they looked at what seemed to be the causes for that, they found that a lot of things were being designed which were inadvertently making it easier for opportunist burglars to burgle dwellings.
Right. Well, just to go back on that, Alistair, I mentioned Oscar Newman earlier in the introduction there, but Jane Jacobs is regularly cited as the person who kind of popularised this idea about different urban environments giving rise to different social responses. So can you just give us a bit of a background on the origins of this debate?
Yeah, I think Jacobs is a very good place to start, actually, as she represented essentially the reaction to the orthodoxies of 20th century planning. She was against suburbanism. She had no time at all for the sort of tower blocks that came in under the guise of modernism. So essentially she thought that if you went back to more sort of traditional notion of cities, of density, of mixing up uses, then you could have she used the phrase social capital, that you could create social capital in more traditional environments. And she coined the phrase, the now famous phrase, eyes on the street, as to describe the kind of informal processes of interaction that took place within more traditional environments. It's probably fair to say that there's a lot of people that have claimed their mantle ever since then, but I do think there's been some subtle, or sometimes even not so subtle, changes to what she thought, but maybe we can explore that.
Well, just on that point, because she has been kind of interpreted and reinterpreted and maybe even misinterpreted over the years. I mean, so is there a key element that you think she's best known for, and correctly, or?
Well, she fundamentally welcomed the idea of the environment being integrated and a flow of people through the environment, and the idea of strangers within your neighbourhood was something that she positively welcomed. But I think the key thing is that by the time you get to Newman in the early 70s, he's discussing these ideas of territoriality and defensible space, and all the stranger has become someone that's actually become a problem rather than someone who the informal interaction with the residents of the neighbourhood actually encourages things like safety.
Very good. Okay, well, that's a useful start. So, Gary, can we just go back to the issue of Secured by Design at the moment? How should or could a designer actually apply for accreditation under Secured by Design?
Well, initially, if you contact the Police Architectural Liaison Officer or Crime Prevention Design Advisor, there are currently 2 titles for that role. And they would help you by giving you application forms and helping you.
How would you find one of those?
Well, we have a website, www.securedbydesign.com, and on that website there's actually a map, and if you click on the area of the map which you intend the development to be in, then that will give you a list of contact details for the Architectural Liaison Officer for that area.
And then what do they do?
Well, they would, you would have initial meetings with them, and they would tell you what the crime problems and what the crime issues are in the particular area that you're looking at putting a development in. They'd also point you in the direction of the Secured by Design design guides, which will give you some idea of the sort of things that we're looking for in whether it be dwelling, commercial or any type of development.
Okay, and a design and access statement crops up quite a lot.
It
on
does.
your
That's
website.
part of the planning application process, and it's a prerequisite that crime reduction has to be considered in any development, and it can even be something which can be cited as a reason to refuse planning.
So you have to get this kind of statement sorted out before you apply.
That's a prerequisite for planning anyway, and Secure by Design fits very neatly into that, in that it would explain what the crime reduction and crime prevention measures were being taken, which they would be included in the design and access statement.
But the Secure by Design isn't a mandatory policy, is it?
Currently, no. There are some planning areas that would require it or may refuse planning without it, because some are actually writing it into their scheme development plans. But it's not actually a legal requirement, no.
Right. And what's the process of approval of a Secure by Design application?
Well, typically you would make an application and liaise with the crime prevention design advisor. Then they would go through it with you, any issues with regard to specifics, let's say the standards used in doors and windows, for example. They would check all of that out. Having done that, there would be a final site inspection by the architectural liaison officer, who would then certificate the development as being secured by design.
And just on that point of doors and windows,
Yes.
In my day, it was an awful lot about fixings and anti-jemmy devices. Have things progressed?
Things have progressed, yes. Initially, Secure by Design, we would make recommendations as for like size of screws and fixing, the distance between fixings. We don't do that anymore, because there is now, or there are actually security standards, and those standards cover the whole door set. So a door set would be tested in a frame, and all the component parts would be the same when fitted on site, because that's what's been tested, that's what would have to meet the standard, and that's what would be fitted on site.
Including the fixings to the...
Absolutely everything, the hinges, the fixings, the door hardware, the handle, everything included.
Okay. Alistair, in terms of this kind of discussion about criminality, which obviously is what it's premised on, what role do you see for architectural design in this debate?
Well, I mean, obviously some things are very sensible to do. It would be silly not to have decent doors and decent locks on the buildings that we design. Obviously, in terms of the urban design end of things, things like underpasses can be fairly unpleasant environments, and maybe we should seek to minimise that type of design and to get something that's a bit more pleasant to occupy. But I think that the problem is that it can actually lead to some fairly sort of sterile environments. I think you start to design out some of the stuff that are the kind of the sort of everyday scenarios of an urban environment that we want to see. So are narrow throughways a problem because they generate crime and make you feel that someone's encroaching on your space, or are they just a kind of quite a positive aspect of the intensity of cities? I mean, I go for the latter.
Well, I mean, just in terms of the way that we see the nature of the problem, crime statistics, as I understand it, are coming down. So is this an overinflated problem?
Well, obviously, I think if you look at the statistics, then they do seem to show that over the past 10, 12, 15 years that crime, certainly since the mid-90s, crime in all sorts of areas has been coming down. What's interesting, though, I think, is that the perception of crime doesn't seem to have come down. So there does seem to be a bit of a gap there. And maybe the question to ask is, well, why is that happening? Now, the way it's posed quite a lot is that crime is kind of interfering with community formation processes, and this is the problem. But actually it might be quite useful, I think, to see it in the other way around, in that the kind of fracturing of communities to a certain extent, I mean, I think it's overplayed, but to some extent that has happened, and maybe that then gives rise to an increased perception of the threat of crime. And if we start to understand it that way, then it does raise some interesting questions about how we design out crime, and does it work?
That's interesting, though, because yes, the fear of crime and the fear of crime affect people's lives. And whilst the crime statistics themselves may be coming down, antisocial behaviour, it seems to be on the way up. And this is all part of it, really. This is about how people feel in communities. And even if the crime statistics and crime figures were down to zero, which I think is probably never going to happen, we would still have, or we wouldn't if it was down to zero, but we do have every year hundreds of thousands of victims. And what we can do is alleviate some of the stresses and problems that these victims go through. You talk to the victim of a burglary, and with a lot of people, this affects their whole life. You know, I've met personally victims of burglary and other crimes, and burglary being a relatively minor crime, and that can affect someone's whole life. Well, we are in a position here where we can do something about that. If we reduce even one victim, you know, that's something positive that we've achieved, and we can reduce the number of victims by hundreds of thousands.
Right, thanks.
Following consultation with a police architectural liaison officer, a formal application should be made. That application must include the following: a completed Secured by Design application form together with an appropriate checklist, a location plan to a scale not less than 1 to 2,500, a site layout to a scale not less than 1 to 200, building elevations, a house plan for each unit type, a lighting specification and layout, landscape and boundary details, a schedule of security fittings. Well, let's go through some of the items of concern in a typical housing project. Front boundaries should not restrict visibility. Fences should be a maximum 1 metre high. Planting should have light foliage planting, and shrubs should be thorny. Rear boundaries require a minimum 1.8 metre high fencing, and gates must be lockable. Boundaries between properties. Again, privacy screen fencing should be a minimum 1.8 metres high, which can drop to a 1.2 metre high fence after a suitable distance, topped with 600mm trellis and thorny shrubs. Avoid blank gable ends, which will attract graffiti and encourage what is called inappropriate loitering. Provide a 1 metre buffer between gable and public routes. Avoid rear paths, especially in terraced housing. Where these are unavoidable, provide suitable lighting. Make sure that stores and sheds do not provide easy access to upper storey windows. Cars should be in garages or on well-lit hard standings behind lockable gates. Street lighting should be bright and even, but minimise light pollution. And finally, the dwelling orientation should encourage natural surveillance and community interaction.
Well, on that last point, Alistair, the building orientation and the street arrangement has been debated, as we've already mentioned, for many years. Bill Hillier, Christopher Alexander, Jane Jacobs. And there's been a huge debate about the kind of discussion between linear and cul-de-sacs and through routes and all the rest of it. Has this debate been resolved?
Well, to some extent, I think it's an ongoing debate. The idea that cul-de-sacs are safer than more permeable form of street grids is contested all the time, and usually those on each side of the debate can find something to grab onto that supports their particular side of the case. I think what you tend to find is that it comes down to quite small details in each one. So, for example, a cul-de-sac that is shorn of any sort of secondary network for movement and that is relatively short with good visibility can claim to be every bit as safe as a permeable grid. On the other hand, the permeable grid with doors facing onto the street and lots of movement through it, some people would argue is a safer environment. So it kind of tends to continue fairly endlessly, this debate, without ever resolving itself either way.
Okay, well, on this kind of level of inconclusivity, Secured by Design guidance says, and I'll quote, "It is essential that an effective and realistic level of physical security commensurate with the risk is incorporated into building construction." So can we just explore this kind of risk-based approach, which Alistair has been talking about? How should designers, how can we assess risk?
Well, it's interesting because Secure by Design has always been, certainly from 1989 onwards, any changes or differences we've put into Secure by Design are evidence-based. You know, we've incorporated more security features over the years as it's become apparent that certain types of burglary, for example, are something that we need to defend against. So the risk now may be considerably different to the risk 10 or 15 years ago because criminals know that much more now about how they can get into certain types of doors and windows, etc. So when we look at risk-based, it's risk based on evidence.
Okay. Any take on the evidence base? Because obviously you were talking earlier, Gary, just about the fear of crime as opposed necessarily maybe to the incidence of crime. So an evidence-based approach on fear factor, is that quantifiable or how does it work?
Well, there's a lot of research been done on the fear of crime, and interestingly, the people who are most fearful of crime are often the ones who are least at risk. For example, elderly females are usually the most fearful of crime, and young males are the most at risk, and they're the least fearful of crime. So what we're trying to do is make the elderly people feel that when they're in their home, they're not at as much risk of crime because of visibility, natural surveillance. They feel that should something happen, there will be other people that can see what's going on and help them, and the feeling of community, etc., can be promoted.
Right, and this risk-based approach to design, what's your views?
Well, I think the thing about fear is that, to my mind anyway, it's something that derives from maybe the breakdown in social conditions rather than the particular urban form of a neighbourhood. And I think that we kind of need to take that on board and have that as a starting point. On the kind of risk-based approach, I just think there's some dangers in over-formalising the whole situation. What we seem to get to is a situation where designers increasingly become stripped of their ability to use their professional judgment to assess the nature of a place and to respond to a client's brief, which after all is what they're there to do. And we get kind of subsumed into this kind of tick-boxing approach where we're ticking off all the particular aspects of a risk assessment rather than kind of being a bit freer and maybe a bit more creative and ambitious in terms of developing a response to a particular situation. And that doesn't obviously necessarily mean that we go and do stupid things because there is some sense in taking certain measures, but I think it would be better if we could downplay the risk side of things and kind of get back to a more sensible approach.
Well, I know you want to chip in, so what do you think about over-formalising things?
I think what I've seen, and certainly my colleagues would agree with this in our years of doing this type of work, is we've been able to go to architects and planners and developers and say, these are the risks, and we can quantify that even because we can tell you the statistics and the figures with regard to crime. Here are the areas that we see as areas of possible danger. Then there is no way that we would say you need to do this, this and this to put that right. What we would say is, right, what do you think would be the answer? And that's actually, we've all had, I know, all of my colleagues and myself have had a lot of positive response and novel and genuinely good ideas have come up to work around what have been problems. Half the time, the problem is that the architect, the designer may not be aware that this is a potential problem. I mean, I don't see any of the work that we do as trying to restrict design at all. If anything, I say there've been some very novel and some very unique ideas that have helped to reduce crime.
Well, I just think that if you look at some of the content of the Secure by Design brochures, then there's certain things that I'm not in dispute with you.
Right.
There's certain very sensible things, but there's also certain things like, for example, the role of children within neighbourhoods, and there's a kind of certain level of fear, I think, that comes through from the literature about where children are and how they should be treated. For example, at one point, it suggests that children need to be under surveillance, but not in a position where they can create noise pollution. Now, that's a kind of a reinterpretation of the seen but not heard argument that kind of takes things in a bit of a problematic direction, because ultimately you could argue that the kind of intergenerational contact is something that actually communities depend on and rely upon to develop in a reasonable way. So I just
Gary,
think
you've got a 20-second right to reply.
I think that's a very interesting interpretation. I mean, the reason that's in is we get a lot of complaints from people complaining about children making noise and youth. That's where that's come from. We also know that a lot of parents are concerned about their children, you know, if they can't see them, if they want to be able to supervise them, even loosely, where they're playing. And that's why now, as I say, I'm surprised that it's interpreted that way. That certainly is not our intention.
But in the past, if kids were making noise, then you might just tell them to shut up and it wouldn't be such a problem.
Right. I have to tell you to shut up for a moment. We'll look in detail at a few more specific issues.
Secured by Design provides guidance for the following. Security lighting must be greater than 40 lumens per circuit watt. It should be automatic with a manual override. Flat access systems are required for any flat, more than 4.5 metres above ground for developments of over 4 flats, and for all disabled developments. However, for developments of 10 or more flats with a common entrance, visual identification or a concierge are necessary. For ground floor, basement and easily accessible windows, a minimum of 6.4 millimetres laminated glass may be required, depending on your risk assessment. All egress windows must have non-locking hardware and laminated glazing. Glazing in high-risk areas should be at least 6.8 millimetres. Key-operated locks are required for all external doors and flat doors opening onto communal areas. Locks must be certified and approved. Compliance will be undermined if a key is substituted for a thumb turn. Install viewer at a suitable height, although a secure laminated glazed panel is acceptable instead. Letterboxes with deflectors must be no larger than 250 by 40 millimetres and be placed at least 400 millimetres away from locking devices. Through-wall letterboxes must have sloping chutes, an anti-phishing device and be fire resistant. A 13-amp non-switched fuse spur is required for a future alarm system, and utilities meters must be external where possible. And finally, party walls between premises must be resistant to someone breaking through.
Well, Gary, that's a long checklist and that's not a half of it. Are there any of those that you might want to flag up as the most problematic, or things that designers consistently get wrong, even though it's meant to be common sense?
Well, I mean, as the list was being read, each of those items, there is a reason why that's been included. I mean, if we take, for example, it talks about locks being certificated. We've introduced these forms or these standards because of problems that have arisen. I mean, if you remember some years ago, sliding patio doors, somebody discovered just how easy it was to lift a sliding patio door off the bottom runner, usually using a spade from the shed, which was, of course, either very flimsily locked or not locked at all. So we then introduced standards for patio doors, and we've tried to, each one of those, there is a genuine reason. As I mentioned previously, this is all evidence-based, all of these things. In fairness to the manufacturing industry, one of the things that has happened in the past is it's been difficult for designers where they've wanted, let's say, a specific window style or window type, sliding sash, for example. There haven't been any which met the required security standard, and that's been a difficulty. But the industry has stepped up to the mark here, and there are now windows and doors in all the required styles, so that's made it a lot easier if designers have got to comply with, you know, conservation areas or things of that nature.
Right. Well, just going on from what you mentioned previously, Alistair, we mentioned Oscar Newman and the concept of defensible space, which goes back 40 years. Do you think that these kind of parameters, you were hinting at it just earlier, the parameters of this debate about community have changed sufficiently to actually influence this community-led surveillance strategy that the Secure by Design is bringing in?
Well, yeah, I think community has become the central sort of government policy in all aspects, from health to education through to urban design and planning. So community now occupies the central place. I think the interesting thing about it is that it seems to be very much based on a community of fear. That seems to be the starting point, is that actually we're all quite vulnerable to crime or attack or or whatever, and that we need then, starting from that assumption point, to be able to design in community safety. Now, I think that's a very different argument from what Jane Jacobs was presenting 50 years ago. She did talk about safety, there's no doubt about that, but there was a much more, I think, a much looser and greater acceptance of the sort of informal interactions of neighbourhoods. Your neighbour wasn't necessarily seen as a threat, they were seen as an ally, and you were quite happy to step in and take control of a situation within your neighbourhood, whereas now we tend to kind of carry a bit of a fear about that, I think.
Okay, well, that's something like a political framework, but we're talking now about some practical issues which are dealing with the kind of the technical here and now. So where's Secured by Design going next? I mean, there seems to be an awful lot of new documents up on the website. So what should we be looking out for?
Well, the sort of things we've been looking at in Secure by Design, if I can give you an example, recently we've done research to show how green is Secure by Design. I can tell you that domestic burglary costs the UK approximately 6 million tonnes of carbon per year. And if you work on one tree taking about 100 years to deal with a tonne of carbon, that's 6 million trees, 600 million trees a year to deal with that amount of carbon, because of course associated with a burglary or any sort of crime against a building, there'll be people going, there'll be the replacement of the goods, etc., etc. So we're looking at, you know, Secure by Design is good for fear of crime, it's good for the quality of people's lives, it's actually good for the environment too. So that's certainly one area we're looking at.
Okay, interesting. And finally, Alistair, just the Home Office has extended this discussion of Secure by Design to other products via the Design Council. Do you have any examples about where this process is going?
Yes, recently the Design Council's promoted a whole range of products actually, which is going to help with these issues apparently. So, for example, anything from car stereos where the fascia flips off into the back to make it look as if it's not worth stealing, to shopping trolleys that have been redesigned so that there's no incentive to steal them and leave them lying about in the local canal, through to things like handbags which have been strengthened, the leather's been strengthened and sensor alarms fitted, and even clothes with GPS positioning systems in them just now. And the kind of quite interesting thing about this, I think, is the way that actually they're not promoted as anti-crime necessarily, but kind of fashionable items that are all about safety. And it kind of captures, I think, quite nicely the whole idea that it's safety first, which when you get to the end of the document, it talks about a safer, freer, more civilized world. But I'm not quite sure that safety first is necessarily freer or more civilized.
Well, on that point, we'll carry on discussing this later, but for now, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Very interesting it was indeed. We'll be revisiting this topic again in later programmes, but for now, we have to thank Gary and Alistair for coming in and discussing the topic of Secured by Design, and to thank you for watching. As Nick Ross used to say, don't have nightmares, do sleep well.